Hi there, Brian Harrison here, also known as Professor Cloud. What I want to talk to you about in this video is a lesser known service that Microsoft provides through its Azure Dev Test Labs called Azure Lab Services. And this has been a service that I've always been very impressed with and I think provides a tremendous amount of value. Let's start by talking about the use cases for leveraging Azure Lab Services. Azure Lab Services, as I said, is a subset of Azure Dev Test Labs, which does have its own use cases. But this particular feature has been defined for training scenarios, for bug bashing, for group scenarios such as hands-on lab environments that you need to provide where you have complete control and infrastructure-based deployments for students, testers, things of that nature. So you start by looking at an IaaS-based training scenario where you're going to have 10, 20 students who all need to be trained on a specific application, a specific type of development, something where you can clearly define via a virtual machine image the software needed for the students to be able to perform and take in the class that they are actually a part of. When I talk about a bug bash, you have a development team who has created a piece of software or a web application or something along those lines, and you want to provide a centralized environment where you can bring a number of users together to actually thoroughly bug bash your application, your system. And the VM would actually be used to manage what software they need in order to be able to track bugs, test the application, and so on. And then hands-on lab environments are basically the same type of a scenario as a training class, but instead of a fixed time frame where all of the students are able to talk to one another or be a part of the same class at the same time, a hands-on lab environment is, hey, look, I've given you the ability to spin up a virtual machine, do a particular set of tasks or course or hands-on lab, but do it at your convenience rather than as part of a schedule. Now, keep in mind that all use cases are supported by available schedules, as I was just talking about, for when VMs can be made available to the students. The actual VM images are available to the instructors to build templates off of from an Azure Marketplace or from a shared image gallery that you've made available via your subscription. Now, what exactly is Azure Lab Services? What is some of the functionality that comes with it? So first of all, it's an isolated environment based on IaaS scenarios. It is, at the end of the day, each lab is its own separate virtual network. Once again, an isolated environment that is secure and locked down via a network security group. You are providing access to your students via proxy ports to either remote desktop or SSH into to their specific virtual machine. It provides the ability for you to define a set of students that you can invite and provide connectivity information to so that they can work within the lab environment. You build the lab environment via a published virtual machine template that defines an image that is either coming from Azure Marketplace or a shared image gallery combined with a virtual machine size. You can define a schedule for when all students need to come together or when periodically over a given period of time they have access to those virtual machines. This is also that you can keep your costs down for when those virtual machines are actually up and available. So you can keep them up, say, for 4 hours a day, but not keep them up for 24 hours a day. The premise of the Azure Lab Services is based on two primary resources: a lab account, which is tied to your subscription, and that lab account defines what images can be used within the labs, what shared image galleries can be connected to the labs, as well as a set of configuration settings such as when should virtual machines automatically be shut off, should these virtual machines have access to other resources in another virtual network, such as a database or a storage account. And that's where the available connectivity to peer networks comes into play if your training image needs access to a database, to a storage account, to an event hub, to anything that would be considered to be an external connection, you can make that available via the peer network. As a reference architecture, this is what a lab environment would look like. You start out, of course, with your subscription. You create your resource group and deploy the lab account within that resource group. Then that lab account can connect to a shared image gallery that might sit in another resource group, or it could potentially sit in the same one. And of course, that shared image gallery is where you're defining your own custom defined images for your subscription. Then those two things will connect to a virtual network that contains a set of virtual machines. Those virtual machines are made available to students via the schedule. They are locked down via a network security group, allowing only ports 49,152 to 65,535 available. The students are then proxying in through those ports and then connecting to their virtual machines via port 22 or 3389. This is done so that those two very, very public ports are never opened to the public, because your students can be coming from anywhere. And as you'll see in the following demonstration, we're going to take a look at how you can actually invite the students, create your labs, view your labs, and configure your labs accordingly. So keep an eye on that. Now, before we go into the demonstration, I just want to give you some quick information about myself. If you do want to get in contact with me at any point in time about what you're seeing here today, or what you might be reading on my blog site or seeing via other videos, there is my Twitter handle. There is my LinkedIn profile. If you want to look at other content that I've created, whether it be blog posts or videos, you can go to my education site, which is theprofessorcloud.com. And then if you just happen to want to chat with me, I also do a lot of game streaming, and you can find that on Twitch 4 nights a week, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, at twitch.tv/theprofessorcloud. So with that, let's head on over into the Azure Portal, and we'll take a look at the demonstration. Okay, here we are in a Azure subscription, and I jumped right into the overarching feature or overarching function of Azure Lab Services, which is the lab account. As I mentioned, this is your centralized location to define configurations, what images are available to your labs. This is where you can actually define some oversight for all of the labs that are available. I also want to call out this area here in the overview section. You'll notice that there are 3 distinct functions or 3 distinct roles here that are mentioned. There's the creating of labs, there's the lab creators, and the lab owners. The lab owner is the person who created this lab account. It's probably going to be your cloud architect, your cloud engineer, someone who has top-level permissions within the scope of your Azure subscription. This is also where someone is going to define the governance and policies around how the labs can be deployed, meaning what images are actually available for your lab creators or your lab teachers to actually take advantage of for the students to then use. What are going to be the base configurations for your labs? That's where your cloud architect and cloud engineer come in. Then, as I mentioned, you're going to have your teachers who are actually going to be managing the labs, defining how many VMs are available, what's the schedule for those VMs, which image am I going to be using, what invites am I going to be sending out, and so on. So if we take a look at just the labs area, the first thing is you can obviously get a very quick view of the different labs that you have available. You can also see when it was created, who it was created by, the maximum number of students that are currently available for this particular lab. Is it a ready lab, meaning is it ready for use, or is it still currently being built? And then what is the IP address that's actually going to be leveraged by the students via a proxy in order to connect to the individual VMs? Basically, what you're doing is you're setting up a set of VMs that are all running behind a particular load balancer, but each student gets a different port to actually proxy into either SSH or RDP for actually leveraging of those virtual machines. And then you can see how many different owners and contributors have been assigned to this particular lab. Now, because this is a shared subscription across many of us within SAIC, that's the reason why you're seeing a fairly significant number of owners and contributors. That's not something that would be normal. We then specify the policies here, and this is where you're going to be determining which marketplace images are going to be available for the individual labs. This is set at the account level, not in the individual lab level. It's then up to the teacher of the lab to define which image is actually going to be used to create the virtual machines. So in this particular instance, I've actually gone through this entire list of marketplace images, and you can see some of these are enabled, some of these are not. Therefore, when I go in and actually try and create a virtual machine template for my students, it's only going to give me this list to build off of. I can also, of course, connect a shared image gallery. If you've already created one within your subscription, it creates one by default for this particular lab account, but you can create or attach an existing one if one exists within your subscription. We then also can specify some automation if you do need to set up some automated tasks, and these tasks are actually managed via Azure Automation runbooks, so PowerShell or Python. Lastly is lab settings. Now these are going to be default settings that are going to be applied to each individual lab. One thing to keep in mind though is that these are configurable within each lab. So although this is the starting point, you do have the ability to go in as a lab owner or lab teacher and modify these for your particular lab. So things like enabling location selection, which for your VMs is determining which geographic region they might be located in. When the virtual machines are sitting idle, in other words, a student has finished working on their hands-on lab, they're finished doing their bug bash, and they have disconnected from the virtual machine, how long should it be, or maybe they haven't disconnected from the virtual machine, they forgot to shut down their remote desktop connection or their SSH connection, how long before we disconnect the users automatically, thereby reducing network traffic? Same thing goes for shutting down the virtual machines in order to keep your costs down. After the users have disconnected, how long do we wait before we shut down the virtual machines? And the shutting down of the virtual machine is what turns off the meter, the hourly meter that ramps up the cost for those virtual machines. And then if there are virtual machines as part of a particular schedule, meaning that are made available in, say, that 4-hour window that I keep referring to, if that particular virtual machine is never connected to, the student doesn't end up taking the class, he doesn't end up using it for his hands-on lab, should we make sure to shut that down after a period of time once the schedule has started so that we're not incurring that cost when we don't need to? And then lastly, as I mentioned during the presentation portion, we can enable a peer virtual network if we do need to allow the virtual machines access to a database, a storage account, something else that is going to be leveraged as part of the overall teaching environment, or even potentially the application environment if you're doing a bug bash. So let's now take a quick look at that lab that I showed you a little while ago so that we can see some of the features within the lab itself. Now, when you open up a lab, it is going to open up inside of a completely separate tab, thereby allowing you to control the access to the lab, giving people access to the lab without them needing access to the Azure Portal. First thing you're going to see is this nice overview screen, which gives you a overall cost estimate based off of the usage of the lab as it's configured right now. You can get the configuration based on hours, based on the number of users, scheduled hours, and so on. You can see what template was created when it was last published. Every single lab will have one template. That template is then used to spin up multiple virtual machines for each student that you define. But you have to generate the template first. Now, you might be going, well, Brian, you've already created a number of images. Why do you need to create a template? Because maybe the professor or the student the professor or the teacher needs to take a template and make some modifications to that template first before publishing it for the students to use. Here's a good example. You have a image that you're going to be using to teach a piece of software. Well, one of the examples that I love using is the data science machine that Microsoft makes available as an image. Well, that comes preloaded with a number of pieces of software to teach machine learning, algorithm creation, and deployment of those algorithms. That's great. Well, what if, as part of that teaching, instead of touching a storage account or touching a database, the professor wants to provide a number of CSV files that can be leveraged by the students as part of their actual data science algorithm training. He wants to then copy that into every single VM. Well, he doesn't want to do it after all 20 have been spun up for the 20 students. He puts it into the template, publishes the template, and then every single student that gets a VM will automatically have those CSVs. That's the reasoning behind that. We then can, of course, see the number of available virtual machines. I'm going to show that to you because that's something to keep in mind, of the number of available virtual machines. That will allow you to provide different schedule windows for a larger number of students than what you actually have of virtual machines, thereby allowing you to really keep the cost down and make it available and as cost effective as possible for your particular class or bug bash or whatever it might happen to be. Or maybe you want to register 40 people thinking that only half of them are actually going to show up. And then lastly is the schedule. And this is where, as I've mentioned before, where you're actually defining when do the students have an available window to go in and actually leverage the use of the VMs. So real quickly, let me just go through each of these. We have, of course, the template. As you can see, this particular template is based on the data science virtual machine. The template contains not only the definition of the image, but also the size of the VM. So you actually pick and choose what Azure VM size you're going to use for these students with respect to the software that's been installed. We then define a virtual machine pool based on the number of users that are going to be, or students that we're expecting in the class at a particular time. Just for demonstration purposes, I only created one. Be aware, it does take a significant amount of time to spin up both the template and the virtual machine pool. If I remember correctly, it took about 15 to 20 minutes to create and publish the template, and it took about the same amount of time to spin up the virtual machine pool. Now, obviously, for one virtual machine, that seems excessive, but of course, if you're spinning up 20, it is going to spin up all 20 in parallel, so you won't run into that kind of excessive problem. We then specify a list of users. Now, you can see that there are no users that have been added. All we need to do is provide either an email address, or we can upload a CSV file that contains a set of email addresses. This will then generate the ability for us to create invitations that will send the necessary information for how those users can actually, or students can actually come in, take advantage of the virtual machines that we're providing to them, and how they need to connect and so on. You'll also see that because this is based off of email address, any particular users can be invited. It does not have to be connected to your Azure Active Directory or any kind of internal authentication system. We, of course, then specify a schedule. In this particular case, my schedule is every Thursday from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. that these virtual machines would actually be available. All other times outside of that window, the virtual machines will be auto shut down in order to keep the cost down. That's the entire point of the schedule in the first place. It defines a set of background tasks that make sure that the virtual machines are started and stopped at the correct times for availability and cost management purposes. We can, of course, also add or create additional scheduled events for this particular lab. It just completely depends upon what you're going to be using your lab for. And then lastly is the settings. And this is where I mentioned we got the default values from the lab account, But I, as the owner of this lab, the teacher of this lab, have the ability to modify these if I should so choose, based off of what I know that the students are going to be using my labs for. That's really all that there is with respect to lab services. I think it's a phenomenal function. My only wish from Microsoft is that they would provide the ability to make platform services part of this environment. So rather than peering a virtual network to provide a database, let me actually spin up a database that can be connected to within the lab for all of the lab VMs, or a storage account, or a data warehouse, whatever it might happen to be. It's easy enough to do, especially with now all of the great new networking features that are available inside of Azure. This particular feature is absolutely available in commercial and government clouds, and I think does provide value for those specific use cases that I called out in the PowerPoint. Should you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and I hope this has been valuable.